high levels of stress. Now, James Baldwin said about the American black experience, he said that to be a black male, and I'm paraphrasing him because I don't remember the exact quote, but he said, to be a black male is to be in a constant state of suppressed rage, which is highly stressful. So take a condition like high blood pressure, which is more prevalent amongst, again, black American males. Well, it's got to be genetic. No, it isn't. Their biological relatives in Africa don't have high blood pressure. The medical science says, we don't know what causes high blood pressure. So out of 100 people, maybe 5 who have high blood pressure because of some other condition, kidney disease or some hormonal disorder. But 95 have what we call essential hypertension. Hypertension is the word for high blood pressure. Essential hypertension is essentially, we don't know what the hell is causing it. That's actually what it means. But slow down for a minute. What if you said the word hypertension slowly? Hypertension. Hypertension. Maybe there's too much tension in these people's lives. And that is affecting the autonomic nervous system. And that is making the blood vessels more narrow. And that increases the pressure that the heart has to exert to get the blood to flow through those narrowed arteries. And maybe that has to do with economic and social and cultural and racial conditions in this country. And the reason I bring up the example of minority groups, like in Canada, for example, when you look at addiction, when I worked in the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is a highly addicted area, about 30% of the people living there, people injecting and inhaling, ingesting all kinds of drugs down there. And it's more dramatic even than the Tenderloin area of San Francisco, if you visit it. And 30% of the people are First Nations, Aboriginal Canadians, who make up 4 or 5% of the Canadian population. Because they're much more likely to be addicted than anybody else. And the reason I bring up these examples is not because there's anything special about these groups particularly, but that culturally and socially, they've had certain experiences that has imposed much more stress on them as a group than on the rest of the population as a group. And I don't have to tell you about the history in this country. In my country, the Aboriginal children were abducted from their families for 100 years. They were abducted, they were forced to go to these schools where they were sexually and physically abused. And now, when they go back to their communities, sexual and physical abuse is endemic in those communities. And so is therefore is addiction and suicides and mental illness and all this kind of stuff. And the point I'm making with these particular examples is just to show again that human beings are biopsychosocial, spiritual, ecological creatures. And you can't separate the individual malaise from the history, from the multi-generational family trajectory, and from the culture as it is today. All this then concentrates in an individual in physiological manifestations like the immune system problems that affect the nervous system that lead to cocaine susceptibility, like the cancer that the stressed and isolated person is less able to mount a defense against, like the mental illnesses that develop originally really as compensations against stress and trauma. To give you a quick example, depression is supposed to be this genetic disease, really? What does it mean to depress something? It means to push it down. I've been treated for depression, probably some of you have. What gets pushed down in depression? Your feelings, your emotions. Well, why would a person push down their feelings? Because they're too painful. They're too much to bear. In other words, the pushing down of feelings becomes a coping mechanism in an environment where you're not allowed to feel because your feelings threaten your attachments. So you learn to survive by pushing down your feelings, and then 15 years later or 30 years later, you're diagnosed with depression. Now you've got this medical, biological problem, they give you a pill. Now, I'm not here to fulminate against pharmacology. I've taken antidepressants, they've helped me. They work sometimes. But they're not the answer. Because the answer is, how does that childhood experience manifest in your life today? Oh, well, in my case, it manifests by when there's any hint of abandonment, even when there isn't abandonment, but just kind of something similar to it. Because, I mean, here's this woman who I'm relying for social, emotional, and physical contact, doesn't show up at the airport, and all of a sudden, a 1-year-old infant was abandoned by his mother. Because that memory is carried in my brain. Well, that's how it shows up. Okay. Or the depression is a result of the fact that as a kid, given the environment I was in, I really had to learn to push down my feelings because expressing my feelings would have threatened my attachment relationship, without which I couldn't have survived. And that asthma is a function of the fact that I grew up in a stressed environment and I don't know how to regulate my own stress. And the society imposes stresses on me if I belong to a certain group. Or the multiple sclerosis is there because I learned, I mean, when you look at autoimmune diseases, 80% of people with autoimmune disease are women. Well, then you go back to, okay, because I learned that I had to take care of everybody else and ignore my own needs. So I've taken a lot more stress than I could actually handle. That's why I survived in this culture. In other words, if you understand all these historical, cultural, familial stresses imposed certain behaviors on you, a certain self-view, certain patterns of emotional relating, now you can do something about it. Now it's no longer so there's something wrong with me. It's just that this is how I had adapted to what happened to me. And therefore, I have the capacity now, as a conscious human being, to become aware of all this and to transform myself. And that's not easy. It's not so easy to transform yourself because, of course, these adaptations that I talked about were originally related to our very survival as young children, and so we think we have to be that way. We don't know any other way of being, except there's something telling us that this is not right. Something's telling us. And so we want to find out the truth of things. And from that perspective, when things go wrong, it's possible to see them as necessary and as teachers. So there's a teacher that I have who lives in California, and he writes, your conflicts, all the difficult things, the problematic situations in your life are not chance or haphazard. They're actually yours. They're specifically yours, designed specifically for you by a part of you that loves you more than anything else. The part of you that loves you more than anything else has created roadblocks to lead you to yourself. You're not going to go in the right direction unless there's something pricking you in the side telling you, look here, this way. That part of you loves you so much that it doesn't want you to lose the chance. It will go to extreme measures to wake you up. It will make you suffer greatly if you don't listen. What else can it do? That is its purpose. And from that point of view, we can look at individual problems like depression or ADHD or multiple sclerosis, anything else, as a problem to get rid of. Or we can look at them as warning signs that we're out of sync with our true nature, that we're misaligned somehow with actually who we are. And that something in us is trying to wake us up. And we can apply that same perspective when we look at society. So maybe there's a wake-up going on right now on the social, economic, and political level, so that we can actually ask ourselves, well, what is our true nature? And what kind of social society and culture would we have if we were true to our true nature? Which is the same question we have to ask ourselves when it comes to individual problems. And the conclusions are that yes, there is a human nature, and that human nature was built for love and contact. It was built for connection. It was built for mutual protection. It was built for mutual aid. And when we rear people and base a whole society on lines that transgress those needs, we're going to get exactly what we got today, which is a society which is increasingly conflicted, increasingly fractured, increasingly disconnected, and where human pathology is, despite all the advances of medicine, chronic human pathology is on the rise. But Western medicine does not recognize that the pathologies are manifestations of a life, that diseases don't have a life of their own, that diseases express the life of the individual. And if that individual's life is changed, so can the disease in many, many cases. And furthermore, that human beings have an innate healing capacity. There's a healing capacity in all living beings, plant or animal. And along with the wondrous contributions of Western medicine, we could do so much more if we actually respected and evoked and encouraged that healing capacity that's within the individual, which is very much connected to the emergence of the true self. Now, for that, you need the truth. That means you actually have to look at what's going on. And there's so much denial in this society. My own profession is a prime example. The average doctor does not hear the information I gave you about asthma. They couldn't explain it, even though the physiology is straightforward. For all the trauma in the society, the average physician does not hear the word trauma in all their years of training. Not that they don't get a lecture, it's not that they don't get a course, they don't even hear the word, except in the physical sense, the physical trauma. Teachers are not taught that the human child's brain is still developing, and that the condition for healthy brain development is the presence of nurturing and responsive adults. And that the schools are not knowledge factories, they're places where human development needs to be nurtured. That's a very different proposition for an educational system. And the courts don't get it. The courts think that when people behave badly, it's a choice they're making, therefore they need to be punished. For some strange reason, certain minority groups have to be punished more than the average. Like in my country, 5% of the population is native, 25% of the jail population is native. And of course, when you ask the question, if the science is as straightforward as I believe it to be, and the conclusions are as clear as I believe them to be, why don't we just embrace it and follow it and do something about it? Well, the reason for that is obvious, because if everything I said here happens to be true, which I firmly believe to be true, and if it is, everything would have to change. How do we teach parents would have to change. How we treat young families would have to change. How we support young parents would have to change. How we pass laws would have to change. How we enforce the laws have to change. How we educate people would have to change. How we run the economy have to change. You'd have to have something different. Well, getting to that something different has to begin with an inquiry, and I hope I've said enough to encourage you to continue on that path of inquiry. Thanks very much.